I used to go to Starbucks all the time. I would say at least 2 or 3 times a week I would stop at Starbucks for coffee on my way to work. I would order online every time as I left my house and then pick it up on my way. I got it so often that some of the employees started to recognize me, and I would be friendly with a few of them. Sadly though, the lines at the location I usually went to were always super long, and one day I realized another Starbucks that was also on my way to work. I made the choice to switch locations to see if it would be faster, and it was in fact quite a bit faster every single day, and it saved me some time. After I would say about a couple of weeks of going to the new location, one day I forgot to place my order online. It wasn't a big deal, but I would just have to order at the drive-thru at the Starbucks. When I got there, the voice on the other end of the speaker of the drive-thru said hi to me and called me by my name. This surprised me because I had only been to that location 3 or 4 times at that point, and it wasn't a daily basis or anything. I also didn't recognize the voice as it was a man's voice, and all the people I knew from the previous location were females. I pulled up to the next window after I ordered, and a man with a headset came to the window. I paid and he handed me my coffee and smiled. He once again said my name and told me to have a nice day, then he winked at me. The man was rather tall and had sort of long dark hair with a slight beard. I have to say I had never seen him before, but beyond that I really didn't think anything of it. It wasn't until every single time that I would go to Starbucks after that, he would be working and would always be the one to hand me my order. Each time he would wink at me or have an almost creepy grin on his face. None of this really bothered me though, but it did feel a little bit strange. Then I stopped seeing the man. There were different people every time when I got my coffee in the morning, and I didn't really notice the fact that I wasn't seeing this strange guy anymore. One of the times I went inside to pick up my coffee and was walking back to my car when suddenly I saw the man again. He was in the parking lot and he approached me as I was getting into my car. I didn't really recognize him at first. It took me a few seconds. He said hi to me and smiled and asked me how I was doing. I said fine in a confused tone and asked what he wanted. He then asked me how the movie I watched last night was. Then he winked at me like the past times and walked away. I stood there next to my car in shock. I had in fact been watching a movie the previous night, but I had no idea how he knew about it. I was really creeped out, and for me, this was the last straw with the man from being slightly weird to completely creepy. I had no idea who this guy was other than the fact that he worked at the Starbucks and was creepy. I decided to go back inside the Starbucks and ask another employee who he was. I first looked around the parking lot, but the man was gone. I then walked inside the Starbucks, which was relatively busy, but nothing too crazy. I went to the counter and asked who the man was with longer brown hair, a slight beard, and pretty tall. I was told in response that it sounded a lot like a guy named Jonathan, who had worked there but had been fired for inappropriate behavior around the workplace. They said he had worked at another location close by, but had moved to that location shortly before getting fired. I briefly told my story. I was told by several people that they thought he seemed creepy and had apparently followed one of his coworkers home one night. It gave me the chills as I realized this Jonathan guy most likely was outside of my house the previous night and saw me watching a movie. So many thoughts started to race through my head, such as how did he know where I lived, and had he followed me home or been to my house before? I had to go to work at that point, so I left, but throughout the day I texted with several of my friends about what had happened. Later that day I got home from work and asked my friend Lisa to come over and keep me company. I got home and shortly after heard the sound of Lisa pulling up. I was so relieved because I really didn't want to be alone in my house that night after what had happened. But then I received a text from Lisa saying that she would be there in about 15 minutes. I went over to look out the window and noticed a different car driving slowly down the street outside my window. I lived in a quiet neighborhood and there wasn't a whole lot of cars that went down the street, so I sort of noticed when they did. It was a black car and the windows were tinted. It parked across the street, but slightly past my house. Of course, I was paranoid and worried that it was the Jonathan guy. I watched the car from my window, hoping to see anybody get out of the car that wasn't Jonathan from Starbucks. But nobody was getting out. Then my phone started to vibrate and ring in my left hand as I held the living room curtain open with my right. It just about gave me a heart attack, and I closed the curtain and looked at who was calling me. It was a number that I didn't recognize. I decided to answer it. The voice on the other end was the familiar voice of Jonathan. I heard him ask me why I was watching him and told me to come outside. I freaked out at this and screamed as loud as I could that I was calling the police. He then hung up on me, and I opened the curtain slightly to see his car pulling away. I then called the police, and they said they would be on their way. They arrived a short time later along with Lisa. I gave them as much information as I could on Jonathan, and I stayed at Lisa's house the next few nights. Finally, I was told that Jonathan had been found, and I would no longer have to worry about him anymore. He had worked at the first Starbucks I had been to almost every day, and apparently asked to transfer when he realized I had gone to another one. I just wonder how long he knew where I lived, or how many times he had been to my house without me noticing.
When I was younger, I worked for Starbucks for a while. Our store was in the shittiest part of the town, in a retail park. The area consisted of council flats, where the local council places druggies, ex-cons, and people who are on various benefits. So, although we had some nice customers who were there for a shopping spree, and there were quite a few shady people too. And this one guy came in and acted like a regular, asking every girl about how we were doing. He was really nice and chatty, but he made my skin crawl. The other girls loved him. The guy started to come daily. He usually came around 1 p.m. and stayed until closing, around 11 p.m. And sometimes, he was very pushy about staying even after closing. He always insisted on helping bringing in the outside furniture and stuff. Some managers and I were cautious, especially since we couldn't have anyone in the store after it was closed. He then started to pretty much groom these girls, asking if they were single, about their first boyfriends, and their favorite sex positions. Yeah, the youngest girl was 16. Mind you, I grew up with narcissistic parents, so I learned how to read people at a very early age. Also, I've always been interested in psychology, and I studied it for a few years. And this guy irked me from day one, but I was nice to him because I'm very passionate about not starving to death, so I needed this job. One day, he started to tell me that he had a fight with his parents, and they threw him out. He looked very sad, and told me that he now sleeps in his van, which was a white, unmarked van. However, since he knew that I was closing that day, he said he'd love to take me home, because it's not the nicest neighborhood. I almost laughed. This was such a textbook way to abduct young women. He was doing literally everything, just as my lecturer said that a serial killer or rapist would do. I just told him no, with a straight face, to let him know that I wasn't prey. He then moved on to the other girls, and I notified the manager about his creepy behavior in order to protect our young girlies. And one of them was this sweet, innocent, and a bit naive girl. The creepy guy naturally targeted her next, after my shift leader also laughed in his face. He told this young girl his sob story and expected empathy, which he got. She agreed to be taken home by him, and she even offered him a couch to sleep on. Luckily, my manager was a mama hen type, and she firmly told our young barista to be more careful about strangers, and that she would be going home with her. Also, creepy guy was banned from the store, and the manager notified the security around the park. But I'm afraid I don't have a happy ending to this story. All I know that the police were later involved somehow, and he disappeared from the area. So, creepy Starbucks guy who's after young innocent girls, let's not meet again. When I was in my late teens, I worked at a little coffee shop in my city. And this was around the time that smartphones hit the scene. I had just gotten my first phone and laptop. Anyway, we had this one regular customer who was very eccentric. He made me really uncomfortable, if I'm being honest. He had strange vibes. It was in the middle of a scorching summer, and he always wore many layers in a large parka with faux fur trim and sunglasses. I never once saw his eyes. He would get out of his car and run for the door in his big coat, shielding himself from the sun. He always ordered almost every item on the menu, but always said it wasn't for him, and that he didn't like the food there personally. One day, he came in and ordered the whole menu as per usual. I was checking him out at the cash register, and he leaned in and softly said to me, "You seem like a nice young woman. I need to warn you about something. I'm not supposed to tell anyone, but it honestly bothers my conscience keeping this information to myself." "What is it?" I asked. "Do you have a computer or smartphone?" he asked me. "Yes, I just got one," I answered. "Get rid of it, immediately," he said sternly. Why's that?" I asked. "I have a friend who has certain government ties. Nothing is private. The government will be monitoring everything, and it's all permanent. He told me they're planning to put up concentration-type camps in some major US cities. They'll use the info on your cell phones to decide who will go and where they will go. I've gotten rid of everything that can be traced, and I'm planning on running away soon. Please be safe," he urged. He left, and I kinda just shrugged him off as a crazy person, but it still weighed heavy on my mind a while. I went on to leave that job, and got a job as a hostess at a restaurant. About a year passed, and I'd pretty much forgot about the whole encounter, until one day, we crossed paths again. I was at the front host stand, where I greet and seat guests arriving at the restaurant, when a limousine pulls up, and a man gets out, accompanied by 2 large bodyguards at his side. It was the guy from the coffee shop. This time, he was wearing a sleek tuxedo and the same sunglasses. He entered the building and says, "You remember me?" I said I did. He said, "Do you remember what I said?" Again, I told him yes. He proceeds to pass the host stand and examines every inch of the restaurant as if he was looking for something. He then signals his bodyguards to follow him to the door. Before exiting the building, he says, looking back at me, "Don't forget." He got back in the limousine, and I never saw him again after that. It was the strangest thing ever, because it's like he knew he'd find me there. How? How did he find me at my new job? Perhaps he asked someone at my old job, but still, why go out of your way to make some flashy appearance like this? I just randomly thought about this, and was wondering whatever became of that man, and who the hell he was.